Also, keep in mind that not all Germans are fascists. There are also decent people among them. The following incident happened recently. At night in a blizzard, a large group of prisoners took out a sharp object, cut 3 rows of barbed wire and crawled outside. The sentry saw everything but pretended not to notice anything. When 120 people crawled out of the camp, he raised the alarm. About 30 people were fished out and shot, but about 100 of them disappeared into thin air. It is clear that they were hidden by the local population. From this fact, I conclude that not all Germans are enemies and fascists. Further, beware of people who are often summoned to the commandant's office and the Gestapo. They are either already provocateurs or are being recruited as provocateurs. In general, it is desirable not to have any contact with people who have been to the Gestapo, and certainly not to say anything unnecessary to them. In time, perhaps, we will think of something with your release, but this requires careful preparation. One last thing. Germans are not fools. Do not think that you can outsmart them. Gestapo officers are particularly cunning and cunning. They all wear black uniforms. Try not to meet them. Watch out for the translator Ivanov. He's a scoundrel of scoundrels. A scoundrel of scoundrels. He pretends to be the son of a nobleman. He's an engineer by civilian profession. Wears a German army uniform. He sniffs out commissars, political instructors, commanders, communists, Jews, and gives them to the Gestapo. Their fate is known: execution. For shooting, the consent of the Gestapo chief of the camp commandant's office or his deputy is required. The other day this Ivanov beat 2 prisoners to death with a stick just because they did not give way to him in time. Such cases on his part are not isolated. So not only typhus and hunger, but also complete arbitrariness are rampant in the camp. We thanked the old man for the detailed information about camp life. That's the situation. So we must serve the Germans? But why the Germans? We have to help our own people who are in great distress to the best of our ability. To our doubts about this, the old doctor replied affirmatively that in this situation our best work was not to help the Germans, but to serve our unfortunate countrymen. We were taken to a brick barrack, which was divided into 2 halves by boards. One half was occupied by women, and the other half by orderlies, 1 paramedic and us 2 newcomers. There were no bunks, just a thin layer of rotten straw on the floor, and that was all. After asking permission, we entered the second half, where there were girls and middle-aged women, 9-10 people in all. We wanted to find out who they were. The fates that brought them to the camp were different. Some were captured by the Germans when they went from one farm to another in the front line zone. Others were suspected of intelligence gathering, although the women denied it. Several were taken for harbouring wounded Red Army soldiers. They had been in the camp for a long time. The Gestapo occasionally summoned them, especially one who was suspected of being a spy. Somewhat later, all of them were shot. Only one was suspected of being a spy, but they were all executed. Who were you really, the unknown heroines of the war? We'll never know. In the morning, when a civilian doctor arrived at the camp from the city, we, together with him and the orderlies, began to inspect all the barracks to separate the severely emaciated from the typhoid patients. 3 huge barracks were allocated for the sick. In one of them we placed all the recognized typhus patients, presence of rash on the skin of the abdomen. The rest of the seriously ill, who were no longer able to move, had swollen legs, bags under the eyes and wounded, were placed in the other 2 barracks. 3 days were spent on all this preliminary work. The wounded were changed bandages. They were bandaged with everything that could be bandaged: bandages, absorbent cotton, strips of clean linen. We managed to treat some of the wounds, The typhoid patients were delirious, moaning, screaming, cursing, uttering unintelligible shouts. Chilled pads were placed on their foreheads to reduce the excessive fever. The barracks were disinfected with a weak solution of creosol. About a week later, I heard a rather loud voice in one of the barracks. "Balaev, Balaev, come here." I turned quickly, but I couldn't see who was calling me. The caller realized it and beckoned me toward him with his hand. I walked over. His eyes, hands, and feet were swollen. He could hardly move in civilian clothes. He asked, "Don't you recognize me?" "No, I can't recognize him, no matter how hard I try to remember." I stared at his face, unable to recognize anyone I knew. "I'm Military Officer Kiselev. I studied together with you in Kharkov Military Medical School at the paramedic department." Only then did I remember him, but he had changed so much that it was impossible to recognize him. We said hello and hugged. A little calmer, I asked him, "Under what circumstances were you captured, and why are you wearing civilian rather than military uniforms?" He, recovering a little from the excitement and bittersweet encounter, told me the last military episode of his front life. There was a heated battle between German infantry and our units. Firepower from all kinds of weapons on both sides was strong. Heavy losses on the Germans and ours, a lot of wounded. The Germans surrounded our regiment, as a result of which not all the wounded were sent to the rear. What to do with them further? Leave them at the mercy of the enemy? Radios were broken, and there was no communication with other units of the division. The regiment command decided to infiltrate in small groups through the German fighting order and get out of the encirclement. But what to do with the wounded? Then the regiment commissar called me and gave me the following order. "We're going to break out of the encirclement. There's no way to take this many wounded with us and carry them out of the tight ring of enemy encirclement, and we can't leave them unattended. Therefore, based on the current situation, I order you, Military Officer Kiselev, to stay with the wounded. The regiment command sees no other way out. Take off your military uniform and change into civilian clothes. We've saved you some clothes. Put a white armband with a red cross on your right sleeve. When the Germans arrive and ask you who you are, answer that you are a paramedic from the civilian hospital of such and such a farm. You have come to look after the wounded, as all the military men have run away. If the Germans capture the wounded, you will go to the farm and wait for our instructions, which will come through the liaison officer. You, as a civilian, will not be taken by the Germans." An order is an order. There was no point in objecting, so I stayed. The firefight was over, and there was silence for half an hour. And then everything went wrong. The Germans drove up to the wounded in a truck. The interpreter asked me who I was and how I got here. I answered how I was instructed by the commissar. The interpreter passed my answer to the officer. He gave some orders, and the soldiers began to throw our wounded into the truck like logs of wood, despite the screams and groans. They loaded the car, sat down themselves, and drove off. Part of the wounded remained. In 30 minutes the car returned. The wounded were quickly loaded, but they pushed me into the body of the car. They brought us all to this Konstantinovsky camp for Soviet prisoners of war. Here I was afraid to say my military rank. I had been here for 2 weeks already, very weak and sick. I offered him the following. "Don't go anywhere. I'll be back in 5 minutes. I'll ask the head doctor to move you to the barracks for the sick. We'll treat you." I flew into the sanitary unit in a flash and asked the old man doctor, "Doctor, one paramedic, my comrade in the school, is seriously ill. He needs to be fed somehow and prescribed treatment, and I told him about the fate of the boy. Have him come here immediately. I'll examine him. After the examination, take him to the barracks where you live. Put him next to you. Remember, guys, we'll need more doctors, paramedics, orderlies. There are thousands of sick and wounded." I instantly ran to Kiselev. I took him by the hand to the sanitary unit. We helped him to undress. The doctor listened to the state of his lungs and heart and shook his head imperceptibly. They replaced his dirty, lousy linen with disinfected one, laid another layer of straw on the floor, heated the barrack, and put him down. They gave him an extra portion of balanda and a piece of bread. He did not eat, saying he had no appetite. The doctor told us that he is unlikely to last long. His heart works with great interruptions. He has inflammation and focal tuberculosis of the lungs, general exhaustion, and a drop in immunity. But we'll treat him. We have some aspirin, We should get some sulfidine. The main thing for him now is to eat a little and drink hot homemade tea. They took care of him, treated him, fed him a little, but he was fading from day to day, and it became difficult to speak. On the 8th day, in the early morning, quietly, without moaning, he died. He died in my arms. For the first time, my battle comrade and friend was dying in my arms. Report to the doctor. Pull yourself together. Keep in mind that when a man loses faith in his own strength, he perishes more quickly. Don't forget where we are. You're going to see more than one death ahead of you. The dreadful camp routine continued, the thought of escape constantly sitting in my head. In the second half of February, the weather warmed up. We prisoners of war were happy about that too. I was assigned to serve the barracks of typhus patients. It is difficult to say unequivocally from what more prisoners died, from typhus or from hunger. Probably from hunger, and the main cause of typhus was dystrophy, malnutrition, and lice. The total mortality rate was 70–80 people per day. The dead were buried by a special team. Every morning the dead were loaded on cars and taken outside the camp. Beforehand their clothes and underwear were removed. After washing, everything was handed over to the Germans. If they managed to hide something, it was exchanged with the police for bread. Most patients have a high fever, delirium. We give them some aspirin. I emphasize that it is not the camp authorities who give them aspirin, but we get it. Some of it from our sanitary bags, and some of it is brought from the city by an old doctor. The sick have to be fed, but there is nothing to feed them. People with high fever do not eat balanda, only a little bread, which the Germans prepare for the prisoners, of a special composition, of coarse flour mixed with finely ground sawdust. The Germans bring this bread to the barbed wire and throw it over it into the camp. The police then pick it up and cut it into 200-gram portions. There appeared a mass number of patients with gastrointestinal diseases. Many of them have bloody diarrhea, dysentery. On the territory of the camp, a lot of people walks shadows, according to the camp name Dokodagi. These people are completely helpless, completely weakened, downcast. Their faces are stammered with indifference, a sure sign that a person is on the eve of his death. Weak diarrhea were also separated, and there was nothing to treat. Often we were at a loss. How to help and how to help. And how did the German camp authorities look at all this? They were, as I now believe, interested in eliminating the typhus epidemic inside the camp. The Germans were not concerned about preserving the lives of prisoners of war, no. They were concerned that the epidemic might spread to the Germans themselves, who were very much afraid of it, and with good reason. The Germans were interested in eliminating typhus, but they did not do anything radical in solving this issue. The deputy commandant and the German military doctor rudely refused the doctor's request to help the sick to improve their nutrition. The second request to help with medicines was also refused, and the request to install bunks for the sick was again refused. But the Germans for themselves began to apply preventive measures extensively. They began to enter the territory of the camp less often. The German military doctor rarely visited the camp and never went into the barracks. He did not even enter the sanitary unit. All the sanitary personnel from the prisoners had no right to come closer to the Germans than 3 steps, despite the fact that the attendants were in gowns. In general, all Germans were panic-stricken with typhus. The conclusion was unavoidable. The Germans had created such conditions for prisoners of war that the more Soviet people died, the better for the Nazis. For example, they could not order that the floors in the barracks for the sick and wounded be covered with a significant layer of straw, which was quite sufficient in the vicinity of Konstantinovka. But despite our repeated requests, they did not do this either. The sanitary personnel had long thought how to get out of the situation, at least partially, and this way out was found. There was a small primitive deskammer, we called it a vosheboyka, and a small laundry room in the camp. The women prisoners, they had not been shot yet, washed all the dirty laundry for the sick. It was a titanic labour. Then this relatively clean linen, gymnasers, pants, overcoats were alternately passed through the discamera. It took another 6 to 7 days. Afraid of spreading the epidemic among the Germans themselves, they agreed to this. What to do with the straw in the barracks? It also had lice. One by one, the barracks were disinfected with a solution of unpleasant-smelling creosol. As hard as it was, basic sanitation was established. But what about food and medicine? These are the most difficult questions in the conditions of fascist captivity. Exactly captivity. As it turned out later, the Germans created more work teams, which were sent to work at industrial enterprises and to peasants for agricultural work. In this case, the teams were provided with food tolerably well. And conditions in all camps for Soviet prisoners of war in 1941-42 were terrible and nightmarish. They were camps of death, arbitrariness, and the greatest humiliation. Treatment of the wounded, not with cavity wounds, was easier. There were small stocks of dressing material, made splints for the wounded with broken bones of limbs. But medicines were scarce. A civilian doctor of the sanitary unit provided some help. He managed to get strong moonshine for sterilization, some alcohol, iodine tincture, solutions of hydrogen peroxide and rivanol for washing and disinfecting festering wounds. Somewhere in the city, he got a small bottle of technical fish oil and persuaded the Germans to bring it to the camp. Fish oil promoted healing of wounds with its rich vitamin content. After pre-treatment and treatment, the sick were sent to the infirmary. What kind of infirmary it was, we will discuss in detail. I stayed in that camp for 12 days, and on the 13th day I fell ill. I had a high fever. The old doctor examined me and said, "Vanya, you have a classic form of typhus, characteristic small dotted spots, a rash on the skin of the abdomen, plus a high fever. Lie down in your barrack. There's a paramedic, a lieutenant, and a pilot already lying there. We'll do our best to save you." What a thing! I had a good idea of what typhus was in a nightmare camp and what the outcome would be. It meant that within a month, 80–90% of me was guaranteed to end up in a mass grave. A doctor should cheer everyone up and always tried to reassure me as well. Don't feel too bad. Not everyone dies. You see for yourself that some recover. My heart became anxious, dreary, apathetic, indifferent to everything. I realized that it was almost certain death, and in the next few weeks. Yes, I saw that even in the conditions of the camp, very few people recovered. But they were few, and they were no longer human beings, but living skeletons covered with skin. After recovery, such people have the strongest appetite. They need to eat a lot, and well, but there was no food, so they died anyway. Although we sometimes managed to give such prisoners an extra ladle of porridge, but in essence it did not change anything in their tragic fate. It turned out that the efforts of the medical staff did not produce the desired positive result. Death daily mowed down dozens of healthy and especially sick and convalescent prisoners of war. And here I am, lying down. After a few days, I began to faint frequently and for long periods of time due to high fever. I learnt about this from the staff much later. I lay with a high fever for more than 30 days, most of which I was unconscious. According to the stories, a civilian doctor visited me and others almost daily, and the old man made the female orderlies take my temperature. He often brought some bread crumbs from the city and, when we were conscious, with some home-made tea, almost forced use to eat and drink it all, as well as to spit out a portion of the belanda, which always tasted disgusting. The old man managed to get some medicines in the city, which were given to take internally. Some herbal infusions were used. I must pay tribute to the girls and women who took care of me and all the other patients. Besides, they washed the floors in the typhoid barracks, gave out food, washed and disinfected linen, although they knew very well that they themselves could be infected. All this was before they were shot. The time came, and the crisis of my illness passed, my fever broke, and I finally regained consciousness. Someone gave me a small mirror, and I did not recognize myself in it. There was almost no hair on my head. My face and body were thin, my legs were thin, and I had a dull, indifferent look in my eyes. The doctor encourages, "Your crisis is over, but you'll have to lie down for a few more days. We should feed you, but there's nothing to feed you but gruel." We had a vicious appetite, but there was nothing to eat. Sometimes the staff brought us some breadcrumbs. As soon as you fell asleep, you would dream about some food, and it was delicious. When you woke up, there was nothing. It has long been proved by practice that of all the existing trials and tribulations, the feeling of hunger is the most difficult and hardest to bear. Neither cold, nor pain, nor sleeplessness can compare with the ordeal of constant hunger. The doctor reassured me that a person who has had typhus does not get the disease again, but if he does, it is in a very mild form. I knew about it before, but the whole point was that we had to eat something. At the expense of the dead, we, like other patients, were given an extra piece of sawdust bread, but still there was not enough food. So I found a small way out. You may not believe it, but I kept a watch. This thing in the conditions of the camp had some value. I asked one of the orderlies to find out from the policeman how much bread they would give for a serviceable wristwatch. It turned out to be 2 loaves of real clean bread. That's wealth, which in camp conditions can't be replaced by any gold. God with them, the watches. I exchanged them. I fed myself and gave some to my comrades. I began to spend more time in the spring air. From the city we managed to bring some dirty technical fat, according to the doctor's estimation, of rather doubtful quality. But we took a risk, 1 teaspoon a day. The fat resembled tar, but it turned out to be useful. The case went on the mend. The youth of the organism played its role. Again, the thought of escape loomed like a star. Shortly after my relative recovery, the head doctor called me in to see him. "Vanya, you are now immune to typhus, so you will help treat the patients in the first barracks." I did not object. After all, it was essentially an order, at least from a superior to a subordinate. It was a barracks of typhus patients. In the barracks there were groans, incoherent speech, screams, most of them delirious. A special difficulty was not to miss the moment when the patient briefly regained consciousness, and at that moment to force-feed him with balanda and rations of surrogate bread to measure and record the temperature. In addition, many patients were in danger of developing bed sores on their bodies when lying down for long periods of time. From time to time, with orderlies and part of the convalescence, the patients were carefully turned from one side to the other. In everyday work, the longing, indifference, hopelessness and hopelessness of the situation were dulled. There was a feeling of need for you on the part of the patients, and it was soothing. The first few days I was dizzy and generally weak. I worked for a week, and the old man called me again. "Vanya, a terrible typhus epidemic has broken out in the so-called prisoner of war hospital, mowing down the exhausted, starving people. They are our people. Soviet people. They send their typhus survivors, 1 doctor and 2 paramedics. However, if you don't want to, I can't order you." "What is this hospital?" I asked. He brought me up to speed. The hospital is located near the camp area in a 2-story stone building, fenced in with several raids of barbed wire. There are machine gun towers at the corners of the territory, and Russian and Ukrainian policemen with rifles and carbines walk between the towers on the outside. In addition to the prisoner of war medical staff, there are 2 civilian doctors from the city working there. There are seriously ill soldiers and officers in the hospital. There are no police inside the hospital grounds. The food is the same as in the camp. Warned not to talk unnecessarily with the sick. There may be provocateurs. Sometimes there may be an opportunity to exchange disinfected linen and clothes of the dead for bread. But the Germans go for it with difficulty. Sometimes some things are brought for the sick by civilian doctors, but at the checkpoint the bags are carefully checked by the guards. Otherwise there is complete isolation from the outside world. I agreed to work in this hospital. With a small batch of wounded, we were sent on foot under escort to this hospital. It is necessary to pay tribute that on the way we, exhausted and weary people, were not beaten by German escorts, although this slow, mournful procession lasted about an hour for 2 kilometres of the way. The civilian population was kept away from the column during our march through the city. At the entrance to the hospital, the senior escort handed a paper to the guard, we were counted, and the gate was opened. We wander quietly and slowly through the hospital grounds. At least here we can't see the police with their rubber truncheons. April spring is making its presence felt. Bright green grass is sprouting in some places. We, paramedics and doctors with bandages with the Red Cross on our overcoat sleeves, the old man doctor took care of it so that we would not get extra kicks and beatings on the way, were met by the hospital doctor and separated from the rest of the sick and wounded. He led them to the first floor of the building. The barrack had 2-tier wooden bunks with rough mattresses made of rotten straw. The windows were barred with metal bars. Before us, an old man and a sanitary instructor, an Ossetian by nationality, had lived and worked here. The doctor who brought us here said, "This is where you'll live. The barracks are locked at night. We have to work tomorrow morning. There are a lot of sick and wounded." In the morning we met the medical staff from the POWs. A week after our arrival at the hospital, the doctor warned us that there were former criminals, mostly Ukrainians by nationality, among the orderlies, cleaners and food dispensers, and advised us not to have any unnecessary conversations in front of them. He named specific names. Later we were convinced of this by their prison jargon. The wards in the barracks were large, no bedding, just rough bunks with rotting straw placed directly on the floor. In charge of the hospital was a non-commissioned officer who spoke Russian quite well. At the request of our doctor to put up wooden bunks, at least for the most seriously ill and wounded, he received a rude rebuke from the non-commissioner. What we have here is not a sanatorium or a spa, but a hospital for prisoners of war of an army hostile to the great German army. Don't forget that if you don't want to end up in the Gestapo, there you will be given such bunks that you will never think of them again. Then the sick, having heard this conversation after the German had left, approached the doctor. "Doctor, don't ask for us any more. Will the fascists help us? They won't, and you'll suffer." For the wounded, we had a little of everything. Some surgical instruments, absorbent cotton, dressing material, tincture of iodine, Rivanol, some pharmaceuticals. All this was trophy, i.e. ours, taken from civilian medical institutions. Every morning, except Sunday, 2 Russian civilian doctors came to the hospital to work, a young man and a girl whose name was Nadia. They were paid by the Germans. It was rumoured that she spent her free time with a German non-commissioned officer. You can judge that any way you like. But I knew that she sometimes brought food to the hospital for the seriously ill. I saw it many times myself, although at that time the residents of Konstantinovka were living on their own. One spring they brought cheap jam in 2 large closed tin cans to the hospital. The non-commissioned officer took 1 jar and handed it to her, saying, "For good work." Nadia told him, "Danke." Thank you. He knew very well that she would give that jar to the sick. And so it happened, 2 hours later, when the German left, she ordered to open the jar and distribute the contents to the sick and wounded. Each one got 20 to 25 grams, but it was jam. Yes, she must have met a German, but she also helped the prisoners of war in any way she could. The doctor, Nadia, maiden name Visloguzova, according to a member of the underground group of the city, medical worker Fedorenko Ekaterina Nikolaevna, left with the Germans during the retreat, 9. The end of May came, it became quite warm, the grass grew up. We began to add finely chopped nettles when boiling the balanda, but the doctors warned, boil everything thoroughly. Many patients were severely edematose. They drank a lot of water and had little to eat. The death rate did not decrease. The Germans took the linen of the dead prisoners of war strictly for accounting, although they did not use it, of course. Some had spare pairs of underwear and towels. A small part of it was exchanged for food and distributed to the sick. But hunger, as in the camp, hung like a sword of Damocles over our heads. How to get out of the situation? One of the doctors suggested the following idea. It is necessary to select something for the population from the small stock of medicines, for example aspirin, pyramidon, tincture of iodine and others, but not to deprive the captive patients, to ask Unter and 2 paramedics with this good, of course under guard, to go to the nearest to Konstantinovka farms to exchange medicines for food. In fact, under cover of this action, we were going to ask the population for alms. Alms. We had little hope that the Germans would agree to this, but strangely enough, the non-commissioned officer gave his consent, assigning a young, muzzled machine gunner to guard us. I wanted to join this company, but the doctor did not allow it. I was still weak after typhus, and in my ward there were 6 seriously ill people who needed constant supervision. My comrade and a sanitary instructor, accompanied by a machine gunner, went with the basket. It was impossible for them to think of escape, as all the farms surrounding the town were packed with troops, but they told about that later. And they told the following story. When they found out where they came from and for what purpose they were travelling at gunpoint, the population met them in a very friendly manner. The population said that their food supply was also very bad. A lot of it had been taken away by the Germans. But everyone helped in some way. Of course, our payment for food was purely symbolic. The basket was quickly filled. Someone put a piece of bread or a few potatoes, someone an egg. We collected 30 pieces of eggs, even a small jar of butter. The German automatic rifleman escorting them back to the city was alert all the time. But what a surprise and disappointment it was when they were brought back to the hospital. The Germans had taken all the eggs, butter and part of the bread, for the dogs, from the basket. They were allowed to take only the miserable remnants of what they had collected into the hospital. Now we were convinced of the naivety of our idea. We should have known the fascists. Dreaming again of pies, wattles, bread, soup. When will it all end? Some Germans, free from guard duty, came into the hospital territory. Of course, they did not look into the wards. They were afraid. I remember one elderly German who spoke Russian well. He treated the prisoners kindly, especially the sick. Once in summer, looking around so that his fellow soldiers would not see his deed, he gave 2 walking sick men a piece of good real bread. In a conversation with our captured doctor, he told us that he had been a prisoner of war with the Russians in World War I. The Russians always treated him well. The Russians always treated him well and fed him well. He sharply condemned the act of those Germans who took away the food collected from the population. So not everything was unambiguous in captivity. Not all Germans were egregious fascists. One day, in the first decade of June 1942, I went into the barracks for doctors. Of the 3 doctors, 2 were in place. The third one came in, white and excited. A colleague asks him, "What happened?" He, worriedly, told us the following. A few days ago the Germans placed a traitor in one of the wards. He has an old wound on his leg and something wrong with his intestines. He calls himself an engineer, a native and resident of Stalingrad. The Gestapo officials have given him paper, absorbent cotton, pencils, ink. He sits and draws out a map scheme of the city of Stalingrad. He probably knows his city very well. Gestapo men were at his place yesterday and today, asking him how the work was going, bringing him good food and schnapps. What to do with this scoundrel? Balayev, invite the officer from the 8th ward to consult with us, the senior doctor asked me. The thing is that in this ward lay a prisoner of war officer wounded in the leg with 1 sleeper in his buttonholes. It was rumoured among the doctors that it was the commissar of the regiment. He was treated in this ward for the 5th week. We knew him well, got used to him. He was a charming man, well versed in the current military and political situation. In any case, we believed and trusted him, consulted with him on some issues, but also helped him as much as we could to heal the wound faster. So I was sent for him. Incoming. "Hello, comrades. What's up?" The doctor told him about the traitorous engineer. There were 3 doctors in the room. me and another paramedic. The conversation took place quietly, with the door closed. We asked the captain's opinion. He asked us a counter-question. What do you think? Eliminate, was the unanimous decision. But one of the doctors mumbled about medical ethics and the Hippocratic Oath. Dear doctor, there's a war going on, and it's a hard, bloody war. It will take many millions of lives. Every honest man should help his army, his people, in any way he can. And this engineer, what is he? He decided to help the enemy. The Germans need the Stalingrad plan for some military purpose. He goes against his people, against his fellow countrymen Stalingraders. What can we talk about medical ethics? The captain was agitated and angry. That's it. It's decided to destroy, to eliminate. But how? The goal is set, but how to realize it, by what ways and means. After all, it must be done in such a way that the Gestapo would not have any suspicions about the unnatural death of their henchmen. Otherwise, many people will suffer. One of the doctors took the risk and injected phenol into the traitor's vein under the guise of an ordinary injection. In the morning, the Germans learned of the engineer's death. They made a fuss, but there was no evidence of violent death, and gradually everything went quiet. In June, warm, dry weather came to Donbass. All day long, the walking wounded and sick were out in the fresh air, leaving the barracks wards with a specific smell of carbolic. It was possible to walk on the territory of the hospital, but in many places there were warning signs in German and Russian. Do not come closer than 3 meters to the wire. The guards shoot without warning. The question constantly arose. How is it there? At the front? How is home? How is the family? The fresh summer air made me feel even more hungry. Once the German convoys gathered all the orderlies, paramedics, cleaners, convalescents, 35-40 people in all, and led them through the gate. We wondered where they were taking us, but not even 25 meters from the fence, we were stopped, given shovels in our hands, and ordered, dig. We dug for a long time. The hole turned out to be 20 and about 3 meters deep. So the mass grave was dug, where the corpses of the dead in the hospital were put, and the mortality rate was high. The dead were dumped into the pit, the layer was oversaturated with chlorine, which was also oversaturated, etc. A sad, terrible picture. You can't help but think, what if the next layer contains you? The expectation of possible death at the front line, differs from this expectation in fascist captivity. There such a state comes rarely. In the daily cares of military labour one has little to think about it. Then on the front line every warrior understands in the name of what he can be wounded or killed. And here the expectation of possible death is daily, hourly. And the main thing, in the name of what such a death? In the summer of 1942, the Germans began to talk about the fall of Sevastopol. Sevastopol was occupied by the Germans on July 3, 1942. Heroic defenders of Sevastopol held the defence of the city for 250 days, and, of course, drew away large German fascist forces. We all felt the fall of the Black Sea base hard. I remember such an incident. Once in May, the Germans brought a new prisoner of war, a doctor of the first rank, to us. He was middle-aged, sociable, could and liked to draw well. A German came and told him to draw his portrait from life. He brings good paper. I entered the cell to this doctor and saw a German soldier sitting on a roughly chipped stool, posing, and the doctor was drawing. The portrait drawing was finished in front of me. There was a resemblance, but I could not feel the hand of a professional artist. Then came the second, third. But this doctor had to live in our hospital for no more than 6 to 7 days. One morning he was gone. The doctor who lived with him for that short time told the following. Last night 4 SS men armed with automatic rifles, black uniforms, with an interpreter burst into the barracks. They called the name of the doctor. He got up and came out to them. One of them took out a photograph from his pocket and compared it with the doctor's face. And suddenly an SS man shouted, "Weg, raus, Schweinerein," Quick, come out! Pig! In the morning, a German from the hospital guard told us that it was a Soviet scout, and he was tracked down by a woman working for the Germans. Everything, of course, could have been... This doctor's last name had been erased from memory. Then, if he was a scout, the last name meant nothing. The police guards were also allowed to go to the infirmary. Some of the sick and wounded managed to exchange their accidentally left-over spare underwear for bread. Smokers were especially pitiful. It was painful and pitiful to see how some of them exchanged their already meagre ration of bread for 3 to 4 twists of makorka. In the camp, I saw people crazily drawn to tobacco smoke, always preoccupied with searching for moss, grass, dung, cigarette butts, God knows what, which can be wrapped in paper to smoke. The doctor's entreaties were always met with the standard answer, "We ourselves know that we smoke to the detriment of our health, but we can't quit." Such people quickly became swollen, weakened. They would quickly decline, turning into wastrels, and in the end, they would die faster than others. In September, I, 2 paramedics and 3 doctors were sent to the rear with another transport of prisoners from the camp, under heavy guard, in calf wagons packed with people. There was a rumour that they sent me to the Dnipropetrovsk camp for prisoners of war. So ended my tragic Konstantinovsky epic, the first period of torment, suffering, hunger, disease, humiliation, and shame. During 22 months of fascist occupation, 15,382 prisoners of war and civilians were shot and tortured in Konstantinovka. 1,424 residents were driven to Germany. 10. On September 26, 1942, the Sovinform Bureau reported, in Stalingrad, in some parts of the front, the enemy came to the Volga.